So thank you everybody for coming. Most of you know me, my name is James Andrews. I'm here today introducing Sophia. Unfortunately, Chloe cannot be with us as advertised. She's currently away from the country. So we're very fortunate to have Sophia, who's going to walk us through some of the research. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A session, so about 45 minutes for presentation, about 45 minutes for the Q&A. So the title for this seminar is Embodying Peace, Navigating Violence, Participatory Networks and auto-ethnographic, auto-ethnographies in Iraq and Palestine. We will, however, today just be focusing on Iraq, as that's the area of expertise that we're looking at. So emerging out of the recent project to develop international networks to research peace and trust and advance decolonial processes, during this seminar, Sophia will share the lessons and findings, also the challenges encountered in accompanying community activities and designing, conducting, analysing and publishing auto-ethnographic research into everyday embodied experiences of peace and violence in Iraq. In doing so, we hope together to be able to explore participatory aspects of auto-ethnography, whereby researchers were invited to engage in co-constructing workshops and establishing methodological toolkits from which they draw, including the likes of body mapping, photo voice, community walks, as well as journaling. So by facilitating networks of researchers through regular learning cycles, Sophia also highlights the importance of trust in one another in the process, and the roles of friendship as methods of advancing critical reflections. Through such approaches, we will illustrate the ways in which methods were used might themselves contribute to a sense of peace in the midst of insecurity, and we will discuss together how an ethos of care might sit alongside methodologically depth and rigour. So I'm going to hand over to Sophia, who's a research fellow here at IDS. And I'm also going to share my screen. So 1 second, please.
Thanks so much, James, and thank you all for taking the time this lunch break to join us for this seminar. As James highlighted, unfortunately, Chloe isn't able to be with us to talk to the Palestine aspect of the project, but hopefully there'll be another opportunity a little bit later down the line where she can share some of the findings that came out of the work there in that specific context, because they are quite different, as I'm sure you can imagine, from those in Iraq. And then the other caveat that I have to begin with is that this is still very much a sort of pilot project. It's coming to the end of the first year, but our ideas around it and the findings and implication of this research is something that Chloe and I and the researchers are all still thinking through together and working through. So we're really keen to use this as a point of discussion and feedback from all of you here as well during that discussion and question session at the end of the seminar, to get your ideas and inputs and thoughts and reflections on the project and the process and how it might be relevant or apply in different contexts, or also suggestions as well of things that we've overlooked or to consider going forward. Next slide, please, James. So I was going to give you a little bit of a background to the project and how we got there, why we decided to focus on this idea of embodiment as a form of peace and its importance in relation to that. I'll then speak a little bit more about the researchers in Iraq, who they are and what we did together, before going on to look at those empirical and methodological learnings that we're starting to see emerge from the project. And then in trying to apply a decolonial approach and co-construct the project and the knowledge coming out of it, I thought it would be really interesting to discuss together some of the challenges that we encountered and the questions that we still have in relation to taking the approach that we have to this research project and working in the very different contexts that we've been engaging across in Iraq and Palestine. Next slide, please, James. So this research came from my background, where I very much looked at the impacts of heritage destruction on targeted communities in Iraq and Syria, working very closely with Yazidi and Assyrian Christians from the region. And within that, I explored this heritage destruction as an instrumental and intentional form of violence that sought to intentionally weaponize the affect of heritage. So those sensations, emotions, and physiological responses that are elicited by heritage. And therefore, when that is destroyed, often in very orchestrated media events, the physiological responses that are elicited through that destruction as a direct form of violence against the body of and the bodies of individuals and communities. And in that research, it was described to me as a form of heartbreak, or being torn apart, rendered into different pieces, just like the buildings that had been destroyed through both sledgehammers and the laying of explosives. But also what was interesting was how heritage had been prioritized by communities in the aftermath of destruction, especially by the destruction that occurred by Daesh, but also the heritage that was chosen to be rebuilt by these communities at the local level, and that being very much the local temples, the shrines and the churches, as opposed to the ancient archaeological or World Heritage sites. And that was seen as a form of coming together and working together towards a shared goal within the community, both as a form of resistance and to generate new affects that work towards building resilience and renewed bonds between different peoples. And so in looking at those sort of effective and embodied responses to heritage destruction, I became very interested in what the role was in terms of cultivating potential peace. And that work to respond to calls that have also been ongoing kind of since 2011, but also more recently in 2018 by the likes of Courtine, McGoran and McConnell in geography and feminist geography more specifically, to conceptualize peace from different perspectives and places, recognizing that there are many pieces, and as Koopman notes, that it means different things at different scales to different groups and at different times and places. And so that kind of led to this formalization around this question of what would peace and peace building look like if it were taken to be a process that begins and ends in the bodies that feel and are affected by it. And Chloe and I respectively have a background working in Palestine and Iraq, and hence looking at these two particular contexts. Can I go to the next slide, please? And in looking at this idea of everyday embodied peace, the thought that was kind of building on the women, peace and security agenda and the gaps that have been noted within it, to understand how structural systems of violence and oppression are experienced and navigated in the everyday lives of marginalized women. And in that, we're approaching violence as a violation of dignity that goes beyond the purely physical to both the emotional and psychological resonances of those violations that may not be perceived as physical injury, but still enact a form of felt and experienced violence. And as sort of, for example, if I were to think to the Iraqi context, if you're going through a security checkpoint and you have to navigate your life in order and make allowances for the cues that might occur. So leaving your home 4 hours in advance of needing to cross a checkpoint, or to re-enter a space that you have every right to be able to enter and exit freely. But that is a form of violation against the dignity of people to move through spaces and to attend to those affects that arise in those spaces that people are encountering in their everyday life. And so, for example, in the waiting to go through a security checkpoint, the sense of tension that may be there as a result of feeling exposed or knowing that this could be a potential site of physical violence, where a bombing to occur in that site, or emotions to erupt into something physical. So understanding what those resonances are, even before physical violence may be acknowledged or appear on the body, and the impacts that that has as people go about their lives. And so it's sort of looking at these everyday aspects of peace, but connecting them to the body, and how everyday peace may still encompass aspects of violence through these violations of dignity, and sort of bringing these two approaches and literatures together. Next slide, please, Jane. So I thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of the nuts and bolts around the project and what we did and how we did it in working with the researchers, specifically in this case, the Yazidi women researchers in Iraq. And I've worked in this particular town just outside of Mosul called Bashirka since 2018, so for about 5 years now. And so it's a community I'm relatively familiar with and had connections to prior to the start of the project. And one of the researchers in particular I had worked with on prior projects. But for the project itself, in this case, we worked with 4 women in Iraq, for Yazidi women, and for queer and or feminist women in Palestine, which Chloe will hopefully speak to later on at another members seminar. But with the Yazidi women in Iraq, what I would say is that they are a subset of women from Bashirka in that they all speak English. So in Bashirka, there's a very particular variation of Arabic dialect that they speak, which combines sort of Arabic, Kurdish, and Ottoman influences all together. And so we thought for cross-learning in the project that what might be easiest was to have a common language in English as opposed to Arabic in this case. And they are all also university educated, which actually is not a rare thing for the Yazidi women in Bashirka to attend university and to have a degree. There are fewer that do speak English though. And they've also predominantly worked with NGOs after receiving their degree, and 2 of them are married. One is originally from Sinjar and married into a family in Bashirka. One is from Duhok, which is a town in Kurdistan region of Iraq, and also married a family in Bashirka as well. And 2 of the researchers were unmarried, one originally from currently living in Bashirka, one with family from Bashirka, but currently living in Sharia, which is the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And we engaged with the researchers as paid consultants on the project. So they all received, were essentially hired as researchers to try and create the sense of inclusivity and to recognize the level of work and undertaking that they were putting into this project and the approach that we were taking, and to try and move away from research as a purely extractive process. And so we initially started in the Iraqi case with a workshop that was 4 days. We did the first 3 days, and then we had a week's break, and we did the last day the following weekend, where they had the opportunity to trial these different methods that we had noted as a way of kind of engaging with or beginning to note those embodied experiences and document their everyday lives as they go through different spaces, engage with different people and different power dynamics. And in the workshops, we trialed all of them. So meditation and body mapping were very, very closely linked together. So we would do sort of body scans, attending to the physiological sensations in that moment, in that present moment that we noted in our bodies, and sometimes capturing that in a table format, sometimes capturing that in a visual format through a picture, or sometimes sort of journaling and writing those sensations and that experience through the body mapping or the body scan. We went out together into Bashirka and did community walks, again, sort of attending to the different physiological sensations that arose as we moved through different spaces and capturing that in different formats. Predominantly, they experimented with capturing that as voice notes, as well as journaling. Then the photo voice was one that they really took to in Iraq and in that context. So that was something that they carried on outside of the workshops, and they elected to continue each week, noting through sort of as they were going about their daily lives, things that resonated with them and capturing that in photographic form and writing an accompanying piece as to why they chose to capture that and collecting that each week. Then the other thing that we continued throughout the course of the project, where the data capture itself lasted for 6 months, were these idea of learning circles. So I met outside of the workshops with each of the researchers as a group every other week, and then one-to-one in the alternating weeks. So we meet each week, but in a slightly different format, either as a group or as a one-to-one, to discuss the experiences that they'd noted and that had arisen through the photo voice, and then also through the process of journaling, which they also used as a daily practice to capture their experiences. But what we decided was that with the journaling, they wouldn't need to share their journals with us because they were deeply personal, but that the learning circles instead would be used as a form of capturing those experiences that they felt comfortable in sharing either with the group or individually, one-to-one. Can I go to the next slide, please, Jane? So what was this experience like? It was very much an iterative process of learning and adaptation, where in that initial workshop, we trialed different things. It felt like we were giving them a menu from which they could almost pick and choose which methods they felt comfortable with that had meaning for them and that resonated with them, in order to enable that sense of autonomy and agency within the project, and to ensure that we weren't directing from our ontological positions what we thought or what we would choose in those certain circumstances. And we were also open to them sort of bringing in and suggesting other ways, which came later on in the project as trust and comfort began to build over time. And the learning circles were a key way of really establishing that. But it was a bit of a Chloe and I definitely felt a large sense of trepidation in undertaking this research and the way in which we were seeking to go about it, and almost had a sort of a mini breakdown before those initial workshops as to whether this would even work. Would people want to do it? Would they engage with it, or would they think it was complete nonsense? Because the way in which the proposal had worked, and the very, very tight tool that came out around it through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, there wasn't time for the kind of consultative process that we would have wanted in the building and the construction of the project during that proposal writing stage. So it was all coming at this slightly later date during the actual research process itself. And so it was definitely opening ourselves up as researchers to being vulnerable to what the responses would be from the researchers on the ground and what they would want and what they would engage with. But also recognizing that there was a high degree of vulnerability in what they were agreeing to undertake in becoming part of this research process, and opening themselves up to exploring these issues and engaging with these questions and the very deeply personal nature of it. And that did involve variation in those methods. So I mentioned that photo, voice, and journaling alongside the learning circles were the two predominant methods that they chose to continue with outside of the workshop spaces. But for some, the photo voice, well, for one of the researchers in particular, the photo voice felt too intrusive into her life to capture it visually, but she really, really took to the journaling and to the writing because that felt safe for her. Whereas for others, the photo voice, because they were already on their phones, so often taking pictures, capturing their lives for Instagram, felt very, very natural. Whereas journaling had to be more of a endeavor for them. So that was also something that we weren't quite sure about as we were undertaking this process, is how with these variations in methods and sort of frequency, some of the researchers every week were very, very diligent, sending me photo voice. For others, it would be more sporadic, but also being open to being directed by them in what they felt comfortable sharing, when and how they felt comfortable sharing it, but wondering whether that would sit alongside the methodological rigour that we needed to undertake an academic research project of this sort. And we came together after 3 months at a midpoint review workshop, where again, we all met together in Iraq and were able to reflect on what that process of being involved in the project so far had felt like. And here's just an example of one of the rivers of life that came out of that project. And you just have it, you look at it from right to left, because that's how you would sort of, if you're reading the Arabic. So it starts on the right-hand side and moves to the left. Is that journey through the project as it was experienced by one of the researchers from Bashirka. And at that midpoint review session, we reflected on some of the empirical findings to draw out themes that had emerged, especially from those learning circles, as well as the methods that were being used and how they were working, and whether there was change that needed to come into that process. And by this point, the researchers felt comfortable enough to begin inputting their own suggestions. I would say there was a big difference from that initial workshop and the level of engagement. There was definitely an enthusiasm around it and a kind of, what do you need or what do you want from us? Whereas at the midpoint, it was, could we do this? Or what about this idea? Or how about we try this instead? And that point, based on the suggestions from the researcher, we decided to alter the learning circles slightly. So we decided not to do the one-to-ones anymore, because they felt that actually coming together as a group and sharing experiences was both richer in terms of understanding the experiences that they were going through and encountering, but also more beneficial to them in being able to join together as a group and feel that sense of collectivity and solidarity that they weren't alone. So we ended up doing weekly group meetings and leaving the one-to-one meetings aside. Also because at that point, even though they hadn't all known each other before the start of the project, they had also become comfortable with one another to open up and to share and reflect on those personal experiences and challenges that they were encountering. And then also to change or alter those learning circles slightly, so that rather than just being an open discussion about what they had been journaling about, to become more directed as a focus group discussion around the themes that they had noted in those first 3 months of capturing through their journals and their photo voice, their daily lives. And so during that midterm workshop, we identified different themes and threads emerging from that journaling and photo voice process, and centered each focus group discussion around one of those themes and threads for the next 3 months of the project going forward. And they still captured in their journals and their photo voices those everyday experiences, but the learning circles were tailored slightly more to become those focus group discussions. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jane? Yeah, so thinking about then how we began to bring all this information together, because in some ways it was almost like an overload of really rich empirical material through the photographs, the commentary through the photo voice, the journals, and then the transcripts from those learning circles and focus group discussions that we had. So we came together once again at the 6-month mark in an analysis workshop, again using some of the methods from that were given on that menu. We did more body mapping, some meditation, but this time led and chosen and selected by the different researchers, and used it as a point to really reflect on both the methods that we used and how they found engaging with those methods. Because I think one of the surprising things for the researchers was how much and they valued both the journaling aspect as somewhere to, or a space which was for them in their daily lives, outside of their familial duties and obligations or their work duties and obligations, and where they could really open up in a way that has often been denied to them, to be completely themselves and not to be responsible for others, but to attend to their own needs and take the space and claim the space to be able to do that. And they found journaling a method that really resonated as its approach. And then also in terms of the learning circles and that coming together as a group of women each week, just to be together and to talk with one another around those different challenges, and the opportunity for learning within that, but also the felt sensations in that collectivity and that solidarity of joy and friendship as we met in those circles. And so alongside looking at those methods and how they had resonated and landed, we also began a sort of thematic analysis around what they had captured and drawing out, again, the themes identified earlier and looking more closely at each of these in their written work, both in the photo voice and in their diaries, where they used a kind of color coding to review everything that they'd captured and begin to draw out different themes and threads in response to that. And then centering again a discussion around each of those, having looked back at their diaries. And one of the things definitely that we found in looking back and through the writing is, even though the writing itself had been part of a cathartic process, that actually going back and reading some of that was really painful and challenging for the researchers in looking at their daily lives and analysing it at this level. Because one of the differences I would say between the women in Iraq and those in Palestine was that for those in Iraq, this research had been a real break from their everyday and from their routine, that had given them sort of different opportunities within the society in which they reside. And there were the kind of benefits and the excitement around that, but also the sadness that would be, they were leaving that behind as we entered the next 6 months and the next phase of the project. But also sort of looking back at that sense of frustration that they experienced in their everyday life around having this high level of education and potential, but often having so many opportunities because of the patriarchal structures and the different social cultural expectations in which they were living, of not being able to capitalize on what they felt was potential and the opportunities that could be there for them if they had that freedom to be able to engage with it. So often looking back at the photo voice and the journaling and seeing almost a very little variation in their day-to-day life in some cases, especially for one of the women who during that period she wasn't, or part of that period when she wasn't employed, and looking back at that and recognizing sort of the limitations that have been placed on her by structures outside of her control was really very confronting in certain ways. So recognizing again what that means for sort of the ethics of what we're doing and the potential impacts that it can have, and the emotional resonances around the type of work that we were engaging with. But also, as she reflected on it from sort of coming out the other side, feeling that sense of having moved through something and recognizing the strength that she had in doing that, which she expressed in that process of looking back, even though it was very painful for her. And then one of the questions, and I think it's something hopefully that we'll have the chance to discuss later, was in terms of these findings and going into it and wondering, we're working with 4 women in a very specific community who aren't necessarily even representative of that broader community. And so what can we draw from these very micro level experiences that have, or learnings that can be taken away from it that might apply in a broader sphere or on a broader field? And so thinking together as a group through that, and part of that was in identifying these issues around safety, insecurity, travel, work, repression, social cultural expectations and patriarchal structures, and thinking about how that might apply outside of death, or more broadly within to sort of women within the Iraqi context, and what they might do or what they would consider doing to challenge or change some of these aspects, or what might need to be done at different levels, at the individual, the familial, the community, and the national and international level, to be able to allow a sense of deeper peace for women such as them, but also more broadly as well. And trying to think, okay, once we've got these ideas about what might need to, or what could be done more to enable an embodied sense of peace, how can we share that, and how would you like to share those learnings with different actors in the sector? So there was also a process around co-constructing outputs, so co-writing blogs together. Unfortunately, you've only got me at this seminar online due to the level of time commitments and also the other work commitments of the researchers. But we're doing a photo voice exhibition on the 12th of March in Iraq, sharing photographs that they've captured and their captions around them, as well as a roundtable discussion with stakeholders in Iraq. And we're also doing another international online roundtable with stakeholders as part of the Rethinking Security Network, and kind of co-constructing with the researchers what they want to present and how they want to present it. Next slide, please, James. Yeah, so the key kind of things that we drew out of this research process together was really that in undertaking the research process itself, for the women in Iraq, it was a mode of escaping their everyday, and therefore it became this collective space of catharsis and care, where they hadn't necessarily realized all the barriers that they had put around themselves, even at the familial level, in needing or wanting to present this picture of strength and not burdening anyone else, but actually how important it was for them to have a space where they could bring down some of those barriers and share one another, and the relief in that sense of collectivity and realizing that they weren't alone in those experiences. And in doing some of the activities around meditating, body mapping, journaling, that permission to focus on the self, which again in their day-to-day lives was something that was so often denied to them, in always often having to be the caregiver to those around them, but not necessarily being able to take that time or space as a luxury, or as being seen as a luxury, to care to their needs, their feelings and their bodies. And then there was the challenging aspects of that, as I mentioned, in terms of looking and realizing and recognizing the level of repression that they faced in documenting their everyday experiences, that was really made visual for them through both the photo voice and the journals, and how those everyday realities were made manifest and almost became more real. So almost a level of increased frustration as well that arose out of the project, and the methods that we were using in terms of them realizing that and really confronting that denial of freedom and self-expression and solidarity within those patriarchal structures that they're living. And yeah, so questions around sort of the ethics of that as well, in terms of engaging with these methods and how there are the positive aspects that come from it, but also, yeah, those feelings of frustration and that can potentially be heightened as a result of it. Next slide, please, Jane. And then in terms of sort of the more conceptual or theoretical findings that came out of the project, one was really around the centrality of trust and friendship in research, and that this project wouldn't have worked at all if we hadn't been able to meet each week and really invested that time, which is, again, is something that needs to be really carefully considered, I think, in undertaking this type of research, with the level of time commitment involved on behalf of everybody, the researchers in country, and then also those supporting it. But this idea that sort of, yeah, what is the role of friendship in our research? And I think it's something, as Agtil Avoyne has noted, that's often sort of overlooked or kind of hidden or covered over, because people don't want to, especially in social research methodologies, sometimes acknowledge the ways in which we really, our research isn't objective, it's not impartial, and it's founded on relationships and the relationships that we build, and that they do have a really direct impact on both the research process and the research findings itself. And I think in this case, we found that the friendship was really useful because it helped to overcome some of those power dynamics that would have been present in a traditional, researcher-participant relationship potentially. And, they're still there in all friendships, the power dynamics are present, but it changed it slightly and opened up spaces where there was dialogue and expression, and people felt free to really share their opinions and feed into the research process, and comfortable doing that. And so that led to sort of changes in the research approach based on that feedback and that feed-in around, for example, the learning circles moving to focus group discussions. But it also changed the choices and the experiences of the women in their daily lives, and what they would choose to do. And so there was a way in which sort of the research also altered the data that was then being collected, because as a result of the research, they began to behave slightly differently. And it's something I'll talk about more, because, for example, they felt a different sense of agency and empowerment where they wanted to step outside of those social confines and strictures that society had placed on them, and in sometimes really simple ways. Like for one of the researchers, it was to sit in the coffee shop and enjoy a piece of cake just on her own, which was something unusual for her to do and unexpected, and where there could be sort of judgment on her, where people might think, oh, what's she doing here on her own in this space? But something that she'd always had this desire to do. And as a result of the sort of friendship and collectivity and solidarity and support that she found in coming together as a network and a group of women, the ability then to do. For another woman, it was to ride a bike and to go out of her garden and to ride through the streets of Bashirka with her husband. Whereas for another woman, she found herself taking that next step to drive within the town of Bashirka, which for her felt like overcoming a barrier. So also changing their choices and experiences. And then we began to see peace as a practice and a process, as opposed to an endpoint. And this idea that, for example, where there is oppression and where there is injustice, there can't be an embodied sense of peace. There might be an external view of peace, but to keep the peace externally might involve an internal sense of repression where there isn't that embodied or felt sense of peace. So, for example, where they were recognizing their frustration with the strictures placed on their everyday life, it led to this need for resistance within the body, or a driven sense of wanting to combat and needing to break free of that. And so peace then began to become this form of resistance for the women, where they wouldn't accept just their sort of what they had been told was acceptable for them to do, and instead to go and ride a bike or to sit in a coffee shop. But that also entailed potentially exposing themselves to insecurity. If somebody had recognized one of the researchers as a woman riding through the town at night, even though she was with her husband, that could have exposed her to physical forms of violence, or even sort of talk and gossip around her reputation within the town. So is there a way in which peace might also encompass insecurity? And again, in terms of looking at the questions around that, what does that mean for the ethics of this type of research? And then also how those methods then that we used in terms of the journaling did contribute to, in some ways, a sense of peace, because they felt more able to live their lives as they would choose, and also agency around that. Next slide, please, Jane. And so that comes on to sort of the points for discussion and the questions that I have in undertaking this research, which I haven't yet answered. But one is around ensuring methodological rigour in this type of research, where we're handing it over to the researchers themselves. And there are some things that I would potentially do differently if I were to do this project again, in terms of when they were sharing their photo voice. I'd probably give greater detailed feedback on that. But also, I didn't want to impose into their personal space in terms of looking at the diary and saying, you know, is it being kept every day? Is it part of a daily practice? And so trying to balance both their autonomy as researchers and respecting that with this need for sort of methodological depth and rigour. And in terms of ensuring that methodological depth and rigour, that burden of work that is then also being placed on the researchers, where sometimes actually you wonder, well, would someone prefer me coming in, taking up an hour of their time, rather than requesting all this extra labour on top of the labour that they're already carrying out, both through paid employment in the NGO space and their home care duties as well. And this is another layer to that. In the Iraq case, it was definitely the case where actually this was almost something that they expressed as the highlight for them in being able to do. So perhaps that burden of work was reduced. But then, you know, there's still a lot of work around the outputs that perhaps might impose more or feel like more of an imposition than, say, the engaging with the other methods during the data collection period. And, you know, we did try to mitigate that by ensuring that they are paid for the level of work that they are undertaking. But still, it's a question that I have around this type of research. And that the power dynamics are still there. You know, I'm still an external researcher within an institution. The access I have, the resources I have are very, very different to the researchers in Bashirka. And there's still sort of a level of direction coming from me, from the research project and the initial questions that I established. And is it something that they would have wanted to query as a priority in and of themselves in a research project? Probably not. They probably would have had other priorities and other questions that they would have chosen above this one. So yeah, recognizing that, and that it's still there's still a long way to go to offset those. And then looking at sort of the boundaries then of research and friendship. So we had these very set times in terms of the learning circles and the focus group discussions when we would come together and reflect on the materials. But then what happens to those spaces outside of that when we are meeting together because of these friendships that are formed, whether we're going for a meal together or going to the park or visiting the temple? Are those still valid spaces for engaging in the research process? Is there a shut-off, or what are the ethics that need to be considered in opening up those spaces as also part of the research process, and still sort of maintaining that friendship? And then I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier in relation to methodological rigour, the idea of needing to meet the requirements in terms of the outputs of the project and ensuring that sort of the material was being collected, but without being prescriptive or too prescriptive and saying, you know, you need to, you said or committed to sending a photo voice each week. You haven't sent me one this week. Can you do that? Or recognizing that, you know, this is every lives are happening around this. And actually, where is the flexibility in that approach? And how do we meet our obligations to the funder, while also recognizing what the woman would choose to do? And I suppose there's a bit where the case, well, that makes the case very strongly from involving researchers from design and conception and design all the way through to the outputs. And this moving from the micro to the macro, how much can we extrapolate from 4 women's experiences to broader experiences of women in Iraq, or whether that's Yazidi women not in Bashirka, those in IDP camps, for example, or other spaces, to other women in Iraq who may not be Yazidi, or then in different country cases and contexts. And there are, I'd say from my experiences of working in different parts of Iraq with different peoples, things that I would note that I do think carry over, especially around these creating of kind of collectivity and space for women to come together and to share, because it's something that when we have done that in other projects, for example, just as a one-off workshop, people have come and said, can we do this again? Or the women have come and said, you know, is this something that's going to continue? And there's been this desire there for it. And then the idea of this ethics of care and insecurity. So if through this project, the women were exposing themselves to potentially more insecurity by transgressing different social expectations around them, then how do we balance that in ensuring that, yeah, they aren't exposed to undue risk as a result of their project, but then also that there aren't more constraints then being put on them in how they would choose to live their lives. If we are trying to ensure agency and autonomy for them as both researchers and as women. And just a quick description before we go on to the question and answer. So this picture on the left is a picture that was taken, or a drawing that was done during the final workshop or the analysis workshop, where the women were asked to draw, you know, what does peace feel like? And the sort of sense of freedom and explosion of color, and this idea that in kind of creating the drawing itself, there is a sense of peace and not needing to look a certain way or for it to be within certain lines, but being able to transgress those, and that freedom that is both in the creation of the picture and then the picture itself. So just a note on what that image is doing there. But I think I'll stop there, and thank you for bearing with me. And I hope, yeah, we can perhaps together begin to look at some of these questions that come out of the project.
Thank you so much. So interesting. A lot of interesting points I think we can touch on in the question and answer. So I see we've got a couple of questions already, which is really brilliant. But anyone else who wants to ask something, please do pop it in the chat and get that answered. So first up, a question from Lucia. She says, good morning from Brazil. Could you tell us more about the number of participants of the workshop and learning circles? What numbers, big or small, important? How long each workshop lasted? Have you shared your main research questions and your preliminary findings with the participants beforehand? And how much do you think they had influenced their own processes? So should we take maybe a few at a time, or do you want to jump in on that one?
Maybe one at a time, so my recollection is there. Yeah, thank you, Lucia. So it was really small. It was a very small project, And so in Iraq, we worked with 4 women, and it was just those 4 women as researchers who were there in the workshop with us. And the same in Palestine as well. There were 4 women as researchers and 4 women in the workshop with us. So in Iraq, we shared a kind of terms of reference that outlined the project and what we were seeking to do, the kind of overarching themes and research questions that we'd be answering. And sort of that was shared through networks. And then we had these sort of 4 potential researchers apply or say that they would be interested in participating in this project. And I met with each of them and explained more about the project and what we were trying to do and see, understand as a result of it, and sort of, what we were asking from the researchers, and then they could decide whether they wanted to be part of that or not. And in terms of how long, then after those initial kind of meetings and discussions, we worked together to identify the time and the space and how we would like to do the workshop. The initial workshop, I was more involved in putting together the kind of what that would look like and the agenda for it, although that was obviously shared, and they were given an opportunity to feed in, and we adapted it during the workshop itself, and they each shared at different points of that initial workshop. We had 3 days initially for the workshop where we met together in Bashika, and then we had a week's break in that initial workshop, and then we had the final day. So during that week's break, they trialed different methods and kind of came to that final day with their findings and thoughts based on those methods that they had trialed. The midterm workshop we did in 2 half days, again split by a week, and that time again, that by that point they felt more comfortable sharing and inputting into what that workshop would look like, and each choosing different parts of that workshop to lead and what they would like to cover in it. And then the analysis workshop was 2 days where we came together in Iraq, and they were back-to-back days. And that was, I would say, more directed by me. But again, they did share an input and lead different sessions within that workshop. And how much, so we did share the questions with them beforehand. And in terms of the preliminary findings with the participants, it's a bit of both. It's, I would say, them sharing their experiences. And in some ways, I would say I have probably taken more of a directed nature in drawing together some of the threads of that, but then this ensuring that those are all discussed with them and they feed back into those overarching. So in terms of kind of thinking about peace as a form of resistance, I probably would say, the way you've spoken, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm understanding. Would you say that's correct? And does that reflect your experience and what you've noted here? Are you feeling that to be have a sense of peace in yourself, you need to have freedom to express yourself, and therefore while cycling through the streets at night, there's a sense of fear, but also a sense of peace within that. And they would then say whether that accurately reflected what they had told me in that. So that kind of feeding back to them, and then them sort of building on that to draw these findings and conclusions together.
It's very interesting. So there's a couple more questions that we've got here, and anyone else, please do pop them in the chat. There was one for me about the recording, and yes, it will be shared afterwards up on YouTube. So please do check out the IDS YouTube page in a few days' time, and the recording will be there. There was also a question from Phil Mader. So he says, thank you for a fascinating presentation. Great to get such insights. What has him wondering about now that is the applicability and transferability of the body mapping method to other topics or fields beyond conflict and violence. So how transferable or applicable would you see it regarding, for instance, research on more economic issues? And he was also just wondering, does it root itself in feminist work in any other ways, suggesting a particular relevance in research with women, or is it more universal? And I think Phil's also had to pop off at 1 o'clock, so I can send him the recording afterwards.
Sure, no, thanks, Phil. Really interesting question around sort of how it might resonate beyond conflict and violence. I would say, I mean, if I'm thinking about sort of, if I'm using a body mapping method and kind of scanning through my body and the different resonances that come up in response to, say, economic issues or financial issues, I think there are visceral responses that are elicited by those questions or those issues. But I think it would be hard to get away from necessarily understanding them in response to kind of conflict and violence, because almost it feels like what is the kind of the embodied responses elicited by economic issues, and how does it elicit those responses? I think there is potentially conflict and violence wrapped up in that, even though it might be centered through or in response to economic issues, or sensations of shame, for example, that might be elicited. But it would be interesting to think about more. Definitely, I'd be happy to talk to you about it and to understand more about what the ways in which you would be thinking of using it in that context. And I would say, even though kind of an embodied perspective comes from feminist research, it's definitely not limited to research with women. I think it's the idea behind it is that it is very much more universal than that and can be applied, and I would encourage it to be applied in contexts outside of working with women as well, and that it's sort of recognizing that we're all impacted by particular structures and systems of oppression in different ways, and that feminist work doesn't just pertain to women.
Okay, that's great. A question from Joe Carpenter saying, thank you, Sophia, very interesting. What I got from the presentation was how beneficial the process was for the women that you were working with. Are there other audiences for the research, and how do you plan on using your findings?
Sorry, can you repeat that for me again?
Sorry. So Joe asks, what I got from the presentation was how beneficial this process was for the women that you're working with, and asks, are there other audiences for the research, and also how you plan on using your findings?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very interesting to hear from Chloe in response to this, because I think in terms of how the process was beneficial or not to the women in Palestine, it might be potentially quite different given their very different contexts in which they're living. But in terms of kind of other ways or how we might use this research, I think that for me, the hope is to build on it by looking at different contexts outside of the Yazidi context in Iraq, other contexts in Iraq, and do kind of similar work to understand what are similarities or differences that may emerge in using these methods, and this kind of idea of almost a call to look at different pieces, as in pieces, PEACES, for different people and what it means, because I don't think peace is one thing. It's so variable, both across different spaces and at different times. And it happened that at this time, it resonated and landed with these women in a particular way. But how we might then begin to use that research, I think, is to think, well, what would happen if we took peace as something that needs to begin and end in the body? and sort of going back to that original overarching question, what does that mean for peace building? Because it means going beyond coexistence, because often in societies where there may be coexistence, then there's not peace because there's still subjugation or repression or injustice. And it's that idea of, well, there's peace for potentially one group, peace for who? Potentially the more powerful, but not necessarily those who are marginalized within that context. So if we were looking at what that might mean in terms of a peace building, then might be around more collecting spaces for people to come together to engage with different practices around what peace might be for them. But that, I'm hoping, will be follow-on funding from this project to think through like what a peace building toolkit around what happens in the body might look like, and how to account for that for NGOs, especially working in the peace building sector.
Okay, that's interesting. We've got a question from Alex Shanklin. Quite a long question, actually. He says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. On the powerful point about peace without fear, I was struck by the dynamic outward-facing and transgressive emphasis of the imaginary of peace in your final slide, and some of the other examples you gave around night cycling. And its links with resistance, the contrast with imaginaries of peace from contexts not so severely affected by conflict and repression, which tend to be more around escape, turning inwards, meditation, rest, digital detox. Are there imaginaries present at all of the research lives? Are they seen as impossible or irrelatable? Are they simply in different categories from peace? If you've been working in Arabic or Kurdish or other languages that are used in the region, do you think that the word peace has been used? Do you think a different vocabulary from talking about peace as freedom or peace without fear?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Really interesting points and question. So in terms of kind of those imaginaries of peace, there was definitely space for that kind of inward-looking piece as well among the researchers. I think that came in part through the journaling practice, but also for most of them, actually, they did also have a pre-existing meditation or yoga practice as well. And I think you see those ideas and influences and how they spread. And I think in part that's might be down to exposure as a result of language and their sort of exposure to Western media, because they are English speakers within their context. I don't think majority of women in Bashirka, from my experience, do practice yoga or meditation, apart from potentially those who have been part of different psychosocial workshops that have emerged through NGOs, for example, opening up these spaces more. And definitely I've been in workshops with Yazidi women where we've used methods like body tapping or shaking, and you get that response where they're familiar with it, they know, and they're sort of like, what is this person coming in here asking us to tap again, and why are we doing this? So it definitely, even within sort of with different Yazidi women, some of these methods land very, very differently, I would say. But yes, for those researchers in the project, those inward facing forms of peace were also there. But just as another coping mechanism, I think, that they found, or a tool that they found useful in managing or processing or decompressing from those everyday forms of violence that they're encountering, and that they were also necessary in that case, and as a form of kind of resourcing potentially to go out and enact other forms of peace in terms of that kind of peace as resistant idea. If we've been working in Arabic or Kurdish, do we think there'd be different words around it and different meanings associated with it? I'm always really interested by this question. The Yazidi, one of the Yazidi women or researchers does speak Kurdish, but she's always telling me that she feels like Kurdish is a very limited and constraining language, so they do tend to bring in Arabic words to it. So potentially not in Kurdish, but then obviously the obvious word associated with peace in Arabic is salam, and that's sort of very much often centered around hospitality and sort of peace with one another, which is quite interesting and very sort of different from that kind of individual embodied form of peace potentially. And there was one example I remember reading about, and I can't remember which language it was in, but where peace meant to breathe. And I remember sharing that with the women, and that really landing and resonating with them, that idea that you can, take that real deep breath and inhale, and that sort of being that felt sensation of peace, and that really being capturing it for them. But yeah, definitely interesting to think about what different languages how that might impact.
And just a quick follow-up from Alex. He says, sorry for the long waffly question, but it might also be interesting to think about the religious practices in the context of peace as meditation rather than peace as resistance. But there was a question from, Deanna asks, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would like to ask how participatory methods influence structural violence during the research process. Do you consider that it's possible to transform in some way the context of oppression and violence?
Gosh, good question. I think it is challenging in this context. I do think there was a level of autonomy and agency that came through using participatory methods, but that resulted in this real sort of recognition and confrontation of the structural violence that the researchers were facing, which then resulted in that frustration and that anger as well within the researchers. So from that, I think there became this sort of, from this anger, this desire to change, to push in their own ways some of those forms of structural violence by transgressing certain expectations or social structures. But whether they would see that as then connecting to bigger change or transformation, again, that's still at the very individual level. And I think the women have expressed ways in which they would like to take forward in their community, if we can get funding, findings and methods from the research to work with the women in the community more broadly and to reach a larger number of women. But they very much see often that, or they would talk about how the women in their community are also perpetuating these systems and these structures, and a little bit of hope that with their generation it might change, but also this feeling like, oh, can it really ever? And that tension sitting alongside one another of both this hope and desperation, or sense that of disillusionment, I suppose, as to whether it would change with the generation. I think that's something more broadly in Iraq as well. It is a very, very young country with a majority of people under 40, but with whether that's around kind of wuster and nepotism that's experienced within the political system, everybody's aware of it and critical of it, but they're also don't know if, even though they want to change it, whether that will happen. And it's the same, I think, in this case, from what the women have expressed to me.
Thank you. So a question here from Andrea, saying thank you for an excellent presentation. As you were speaking about the group process, it seems to align well with social transformative learning, English and Irving, 2015, Manicom and Walters, 2012, which is a framework that I'm looking at for my PhD. I'm wondering if this is a framework you were working with specifically for this project, and if so, it would be great to follow up.
No, it's not, but I'm definitely going to go now and look it up to see where the overlaps are and how, yeah, it might be useful to draw on it, but would definitely be very interested to speak to you more about it, Andrea. So thank you for raising that and sharing it.
I can't see any more questions unless someone's got a quick one they want to pop into the chat. No? Well, if we're happy to draw it to a close there, thank you so much for your presentation. Again, sorry to everyone that Chloe Skinner cannot be with us. As I said, she's currently otherwise engaged. The recording will be up on YouTube in a couple of days' time, so please do follow up there. And I will share it with those people who had to pop off at 2 o'clock. Yeah, thank you so much to Sophia. It's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, there's a few points that you wanted to follow up on there. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. And for your really stimulating questions as well.
Bye-bye.